Hey people, Raz here. Do you love tanks? Of course you do. They're a part of you. From the rattling of the tracks dragging against the ground, to the whine of the turbine engine as it creeps forward, to the near sonic boom of the cannon as the shell ejects from the breech. I love tanks. I really love tanks. In fact, this episode marks the beginning of an 80-episode tank review series I will be doing. Mainly because I don't have room to build all these goddamn airplanes I bought. So, let's begin. The year was 1917. It was a chilly August morning. The crew of the Fray Bentos set out to take their objectives. Their tank lurched forward. It goes to full speed, a blistering 4 miles per hour. The crew compartment slowly fills with smoke as the unshielded engine vents out exhaust amongst the men. The temperature in the cabin starts to rise. The entire tank essentially becomes an easy bake oven. It's now over 120 degrees. Then, the British artillery started to drop, a creeping barrage from the British lines. They could hear the shells screeching overhead. The tank rolled over the trench into no man's land, slowly creeping along with the other 8 tanks in their unit. They could see the smoke in the distance where the artillery had hit. Then, when they were about 100 meters out, the Germans started firing. Artillery was going off all around them. It took out a tank to their left and then their right, but they still trudged forward. They were almost to the German trenches when they went over an embankment, and then the tank flipped sideways. It was stuck. After attempting to unditch the tank, they slowly realized they were stuck in a shell hole not 30 meters from the German trenches. For nearly 3 days, a total of 62 hours, they endured rifle fire, machine gun fire, grenades, German artillery, British artillery, and my favorite, dynamite. They were living off of a single day's worth of rations, and the water they were drinking was from their tank's radiator. After it went dark on the 3rd day, the crew had had enough of their little staycation. They crawled out with their machine guns in tow back to their lines. Remarkably, they only lost 1 man out of their 9-man crew. Pretty much everyone was wounded, though. While this story sounds like pure Hollywood, it's completely real. In fact, it was the inspiration for the final scene in the movie Fury. Fury, of course, being a historically accurate film, some historians even comparing it to a documentary. But I digress. Why, hello, weary traveler. Sit ye down by the fire, and let me spin you a yarn. Let me tell you about the granddaddy of all tanks, the big and majestic rhombus that started it all, the British Mark I. It had 2 guns, 2 wheels, and 2 tracks. This thing looks almost as alien today as it did in 1917. Now, on the count of 3, I'm going to ask you to imagine how this tank sounded in real life. Are you ready? Yeah, I didn't think it sounded like that either. It really puts the massive tank charges of Cambrai into perspective. The squeaking metal death box slowly crawling its way towards you. I know now why all of those Germans were pissing their pants. They were just 1 squeak away from death. But I digress. Now, to really understand this tank, you have to get an idea of how messy and crazy the development cycle was. You see those wheels on back? Not needed. Those guns on the side? Too damn big, they couldn't even get over holes. You see those hatches on the back? Too small for people to get in and out of. To say this tank was experimental is giving it too much credit. This thing was barely serviceable when it was released. In fact, out of the 150 made, 87 of them broke down within 5 miles of where they were deployed. These were not good tanks. Most people who are watching this probably think this is a Mark V tank. You see, the Mark V was the better, more improved version of this tank. It had shorter guns, no wheels, and a rack to mount trench crossing equipment and unditching gear. Real quick, I'm going to spit some fun facts your way. I'm going to combine all of the Mark series tanks into this review because, let's face it, you want it that way. The Mark I was a prototype, only 150 were made. Most were deployed in the Somme and either broke down or were destroyed. The Mark II and Mark III were just training tanks with little or no armor. Only about 50 of each were made. Due to short supplies and much to the detriment of the crew, they were deployed in Arras to high casualties. The Mark IV was the first mass-produced tank, and nearly 1,200 were built. They moved the gas tank from the front to the back and made the guns smaller. Also, they fitted unditching gear to the top. They were most famously deployed in the Battle of Cambrai. The Mark V tank had a newer engine, better driving mechanism, and more armor. They were deployed in Amiens or in the Russian Revolution, and many served in Russia until 1928. Only around 400 were produced. In 1915, First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston "I'm not drunk, just having a good time" Churchill, decided that the army was too sober to see his grand scheme of land ships ferrying men to the enemy trenches across no man's land. And quite possibly a drunken stroke of genius, Churchill stepped on some toes and formed the Land Ship Committee. The whole idea initially was to have troop transports. First, they tried Little Willie. After its, well, let's just say lackluster performance, they took the lessons learned and built the Mark I tank. When they started the Mark I project, they realized that the troop transport idea wasn't going to work, and decided instead to make a mobile bunker of death. This tank was designed to cross trenches and shell holes with the troops, to follow the infantry in and clean up pockets of resistance that they couldn't reach. Unfortunately, the designers made the first fatal mistake of tank design: don't rivet your armor with bolts. The main reason this is a bad idea is because when there's an explosion on the outside of a tank, which tends to happen a lot, the bolts puncture into the crew department and become shrapnel, literally shredding everyone inside like a pipe bomb. On top of that, the engine didn't have any exhaust ports. The simple act of turning the engine on would vent exhaust fumes among the men. Many tank crews suffered from pulmonary diseases like COPD, emphysema, and chronic bronchitis. This caused many of the crew members to get sick after an hour in the tank, which rendered it almost useless. Other than gassing their own men, this tank also lacked any form of ventilation. Engine exhaust, heat, and smoke from the guns were all trapped inside the crew compartment with you. The tank lacked adequate view slits and was prone to breakdowns. Learning their lesson, they tested other models. The Mark IV and Mark V were arguably the most refined versions. They were more streamlined with better engines, smaller guns, and no extra wheels. Also, they had mounts to hold trench crossing gear and unditchers. Now, I find this equipment probably a little more interesting than you do, so I'll be quick. But trench crossing gear came in several forms. The most popular was a giant bundle of sticks or a steel cage the tank would carry and then drop into the trench when it was ready to cross. Unditchers were wooden railroad ties mounted on chains to the top bar. They were designed to be dropped in front of the tank tread so the tracks had something to grip onto in case it got stuck. Overall, by the end of the war, they had a very formidable tank. In the early days, tank doctrine was more of a thing than it is today. Now, MBTs dominate the battlefield. Tanks back then were designed to fill certain roles. This tank would be adapted into several different variants until the end of its life, where it would serve past the First World War. Most famously, this tank served in the Russian Revolution. Today, most of the surviving tanks actually sit in Russia. While today it's not remembered as a good tank, it was definitely a technological leap built out of necessity during that time. It fit the role it was needed for and would have likely evolved into something more formidable had the war kept going past 1918. So now, on to the review. But first, let's see what gifts God King Cobi has bestowed upon us today. It's a classic tin of English breakfast tea. One of the creature comforts of being part of the poor bloody infantry at this time was the daily tea rations. Typically, regulars were issued 5/8 an ounce of tea a day, which is roughly enough to make a single good cup or several shitty cups of tea. While they were only supposed to get that amount, typically the officers were just handed a tin by the supply depot and would disperse it however the hell they wanted. This was important because boiling the water was necessary at the front. Much of the water was contaminated by disease, gas, or flies. Also, if there was an advance, typically the retreating army would poison the watering supplies at their old positions to hopefully maim a few more of the boys. Tea was pretty important because it made this water more palatable, since the putrid smell of the dead lingered all along the front. While it was hard to get the troops their daily jam, meat, or vegetable rations, a few things like tea and biscuits were always in supply. Now, on to the review. This is a pretty difficult tank to review. I like some of the parts almost as much as I hate the other parts. Overall, the tank achieved the proper shape and looks for the part. However, my main complaints are the wheels, sponsons, and insignia, and most importantly, the tracks. Let's start with the sponsons. Here, there are two things I would have changed. Number one, the gun only rotates side to side and does not go up and down. This makes it almost impossible to pose it pointing in any other directions. The next issue are the hinges that connect the door to the step. You can move these up and down, which sometimes happens by accident, and just doesn't look very good. Next, let's look at the insignia. Unfortunately, instead of printing it onto a block on the chassis, they made it a whole flat piece which you could disconnect. It makes it feel cheap and doesn't look as good as I know Cobi could do. Next is the rear of the tank. While it's very detailed, I can't stand the wheels on the back. They make the model extremely hard to store in a shelf and are really delicate and hard to disconnect. However, the biggest flaw in this model is its tracks. They don't roll easily, if at all. Usually they roll backwards better than forwards. Honestly, with the shape of the model and everything that has to go into constructing the frame, I'm not surprised. When you take the tracks off, you can really see where the model struggles. The jagged pieces and lack of rollers around the frame cause the tracks to get stuck constantly and make it very hard to play with and roll. Other than these flaws, I really don't have too many complaints about the overall design. If you have kids, this tank is an absolute brick. It's going to be very hard to tear up anything on it. I could see issues with maybe the wheels and the guns, but other than that, you could probably throw this thing against the wall and nothing would break. The tracks might be another area of concern since they tend to get caught and fall apart on their own. Since displaying this tank is one of the main functions you're going to use as an adult, it's difficult to recommend this tank because it's very hard to fit on a shelf. Also, this tank has committed a cardinal sin against the Cobi community. It isn't 1/35th scale, which a lot of people, including myself, like because it looks more accurate next to the minifigs. I'd stay away from this tank unless you're overall in love with the design of it like I was, or have a huge void of space that you have to store this. It's a very pretty model if you like the British Mark series of tanks. I wish Cobi would take another stab at this and make a Mark IV instead. The Mark IV had more detailing because of the unditching mounts and was shorter lengthwise with smaller guns on the side. Even if they couldn't fix the rolling issues, I'd still buy it because the Mark IV is just the more iconic of the two. Overall, I'd give this tank an 8 out of 10. It looks good, but it's hard to forgive the lack of functionality and overall difficulty rolling it. It has some severe design issues, but the amount of detail they achieved is great. I hope you've enjoyed reading this report as much as I've enjoyed writing it. For real though, I promise to make the next review a lot shorter. My attention span lasts only about 10 minutes, but with this review in particular, I had a lot of history I wanted to cover. Anyways, thanks for watching. You're all truly wonderful. Up next is the Renault FT. Bye for now.